And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development. Okay, a few notes about the evolving situation with teaching and learning and schools trying to resume operations in light of COVID-19. At least here in the Northern Hemisphere, many schools are preparing to try to open, sometimes online, sometimes in person. But it appears that many schools will be operating in an online environment. So in light of that, we are going to be offering more explicit workshops on how to teach in an online setting. Truth be told, all of our workshops are geared towards good teaching and learning that could and should be done in online or face-to-face settings, but we recognize that schools and teachers probably need some support and help in really focusing on delivering high-quality, engaging online teaching and learning. So with that in mind, if you go to wegrowteachers.com, you'll find options for online workshops to help teachers and schools think more clearly and effectively about teaching and learning in an online setting. And we're also going to be offering some sort of micro courses, if you will, that will deliver shorter bursts of workshop content on demand, sort of like Netflix style, with the option to talk live via Google Meet or some other video chat format with that particular facilitator or, in some cases, author of a book. All the details will be available again on wegrowteachers.com hopefully soon as we roll those out, probably one course at a time, but hopefully those are helpful to meet teachers' needs in this time of uncertainty as well. In this podcast, I spoke with Rod Graham, who is an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at Old Dominion University. I first saw Rod in a discussion online with one of my favorite depolarization organizations, Braver Angels. That was moderated by John Wood Jr., and if you're interested in learning more about John and Braver Angels, I've had him on the podcast a couple times, once fairly recently. And I really enjoyed Rod's humility and grace as he was talking about some pretty important issues with regards to racism and critical theory and things like that. So I wanted to talk with him, and we did talk about some of those things in sort of a critique or discussion of white fragility and Robin DiAngelo's work and critical theory, critical race theory, postmodernism in general, and how he perceives, at least, there's maybe a shift in mindset among younger people to be questioned or question things a little bit more, and how we might really make sure that we're pursuing an evidence-based equity and diversity programming or programs or efforts to, I guess for lack of a better term, pursue the ideals of the country. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. I certainly did, and without further ado, here's Rod Graham. Rod, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on here, and I want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit of background on yourself, some context so that folks know who I'm talking to before we get into the meat of our conversation.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Rod Graham. I'm an associate professor at Old Dominion University. And at Old Dominion University, I really focus on issues of technology, cybercrime, or how people live online. But I also teach courses on race, generally once a year, and I think that's what we'll focus on here, and research methods, which kind of also goes into what we'll focus on here, because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with critical race theory, or critical theory in general, they sort of intersect. All right, so we're interested in understanding racial inequality, but we're also interested in how it is that we understand racial inequality. So I teach those things, and yeah, that's me.
Yeah, so just so folks have an idea, I first came across you, thankfully, by listening to a Braver Angels, I guess, podcast or video. I'm not sure exactly what it was specifically called, but John Wood Jr., who's been on the podcast a few times, and he was moderating a discussion with you and Wilford Riley about some of these kinds of issues, but not specifically about education, with which we're going to use as a lens, because that's our sort of area of work as well. But then I followed a little bit of a rabbit hole into some of your other work and some other videos that I'll try and link in our show notes as well. But what I appreciated, even though, and especially actually in some ways, as I mentioned in our other conversations prior to going live here, is that I don't think we necessarily agree on everything, which is part of the reason why I wanted to have the conversation. But I guess as a side note, I appreciated the way that you think about things, and I think it's worth having conversations with people with whom we might have disagreements, and just to learn from one another and think through some of the pieces. And for us, our audience is primarily, best we can tell, educators, and certainly this is a relevant topic as they're trying to I don't know, I guess not only prepare for school in a pandemic world, but also think about the raised sort of issues of that were raised, very recently by the killing of George Floyd, and how that's really brought a lot of these things to the forefront. I'm seeing lots of educators really pushing out material and writing about and talking about anti-racism. And so I think it's worth really kind of diving into and giving as many perspectives about that. So there's so many ways in which we might talk about this, and you have done some work in those other pieces that I mentioned in some defense of critical theory, critical race theory, white fragility, Robin DiAngelo, and those kinds of things. But as we were talking live, you're not a critical theorist. You're not necessarily wanting to be in that role of defense per se, but thinking about how we can use those things and find the value in them. And I guess what is it that, I guess, what is your sort of elevator pitch for some of those? It's a big sweeping generalization, a lot of topics there of critical theory, critical race theory, white fragility, but what's the elevator pitch for why we should use those things especially in an education setting, as we're thinking about equity, diversity, teaching and learning, those kinds of things?
Well, I see critical theory as a kind of activist methodology, and critical theorists as scholar activists. And the general push is to identify mechanisms in society that reproduce inequality or are oppressive. And so just on that alone, there's value in that, because in our everyday lives, we're not really looking at those kinds of things. And so it's nice to have a dedicated group of scholars and methods that try and improve society. Sometimes it can go off the rails, obviously, but I think overall it's been a benefit. For example, if you can list all of those ideas that are often criticized, you'll find that all of them end up benefiting some group. So let's take safe spaces, which has been criticized, or this idea of microaggressions, which has been criticized. Well, okay, I understand people may say, well, these ideas are very vague, or they may create some division in society, but they also benefit some groups. If you're a black person or someone who's gay or transgender, and there's no objective way of identifying or of measuring this sense of uneasiness you have, well, you find it in the concept of microaggressions. If you talk to people who are the other in their environment, they will tell you that, look, sometimes I get the sense that, people are treating me unfairly, and, how would I articulate that? Well, if in the absence of critical theory, you don't articulate it. You just have this sense that something's wrong, and maybe you suffer. Other people are fine, but you suffer. Whereas, critical theorists would try and identify that phenomenon, bring it to light, and then try and address it. And so, for all of these things. So what else might pop up? For the example, another example would be lived experiences, which also gets a lot of flack from some people. And so I find that to be incredibly valuable, because if you're not going to acknowledge the experiences of other people, you can erase those experiences, and those people suffer. And I think it is the case that racial minorities, women, and transgender, gay, lesbian, all of the letters, LGBTQ, IA, I think, is also now part of it. They do have experiences that maybe that I wouldn't have. So it's good that I acknowledge that they're experiencing things differently than me, so that I can be more sensitive to their concerns. So I find those things to be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and I think that's I find the value in that as well. I mean, I think that there's a real value in recognizing those perspectives and those as you said, lived experiences. Does it take critical theory or critical race theory to do that? Is there I guess I wonder if we can do that, or in what ways we might do that without critical theory. And I guess conversely, are there things about critical theory? I mean, as you've recognized, and I think it's not really a secret, that there are some ways in which it can go overboard. And I do think, or at least it seems to me from what I know, and I'm not an expert in this, that critical theory has changed over the last maybe, 5 to 10 years from its original underpinnings. And as I understand it, the person who was originally sort of founding it or responsible for the theory is not necessarily consistent with the thinking of that founder. The name I'm not remembering, is not particularly consistent with sort of the postmodern version of it right now.
I see. Well, so the first part of the question is, can we get at those answers without critical theory? I would say it's possible, but the way that science is usually done is you try to not impute any political values into your work. So when I teach my research methods course, I separate the pursuit of knowledge into 3 streams. So one stream is probably the one that most people are aware of. It would be the kind of a positivist or quantitative methods approach, where you have the research question, you have the hypothesis and the null hypothesis, you collect data, and then you say yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down. It's what we all learn in high school, and we carry it to college. And that's a very powerful way of understanding general laws of human or of behavior, or just general laws in general. A second way is qualitative research, which should also be somewhat value-free. So a lot of sociologists, instead of trying to collect some numbers on something, some kind of measurement, we realize that there are a lot of things that you really can't measure. It's really hard to measure frustration or mistrust of police, or understand how people think about poverty through numbers. And so what they would do is they would do some kind of ethnographic work, where they would interview people, or they would observe people in their everyday lives and try and understand the meaning that they attach to their lives. That's very important for understanding our social world, because it's so complex. You can't put it down to numbers. But even in that case, the idea is not necessarily to change the lives of people. It's just to understand it. So it's also supposed to be as value-free as possible. You're going into that scene with values, but you try to just understand what the people are doing in that scene. Okay, well, fine. I mean, sociologists have been taking this data and these studies, this information, and then applying it to public policy forever, but it's not explicitly about trying to change something. Whereas critical theory, they may take some of the methods from quantitative work and qualitative work, but they are explicitly saying, okay, there is sexism here. I'm going to use my knowledge as a scholar and the methods that are available to me to identify how this is occurring, give it a name, and then also figure out how to deal with it. So so it's possible to certainly come to the same end without critical theory, but I think critical theory is just a more direct way critical theory is a more direct way of getting at it. You mentioned that the originator. I'm not quite sure about if there's one person. I do believe that when it comes to critical race theory, people often peg that to Kimberly Crenshaw, who I think was a lawyer.
Yeah.
But the overall ideas, I think it's from a variety of postmodernist scholars who have a broad philosophy about how the world works, and then critical theory is a kind of application of that understanding of how the world works, which I think there's some truth in it, actually. There's this, so just in broad strokes, postmodernists would argue that, everyone sees the world differently. After the end of the Second World War and through the 50s and 60s, we had this information overload. And this is before the internet, they were talking about this, so I would suggest that it would be intensified now. We've got this information overload, so people in groups are producing magazines and radio and to some extent television. So you're seeing all of these different ways, or you're taking in all this information that may not be what you were used to in your hometown. Then there's a receding of Christianity in the world, in the Western world. So you kind of lose that overarching understanding. There was this critique of Enlightenment era values, where before the U.S. or before the nuclear age and before the U.S. dropped bombs on Japan, there was this unfailing faith in reason, progress, and science. But then people started saying, "Hey, wait a minute! Science will get us destroyed," And so there was a kind of questioning of this idea of unending progress through science. I call it Enlightenment era values. And then also, society is not as hierarchical as it used to be. We lost those ideas of the British being the top country, the most advanced country, and or European countries being the most advanced, and so that necessarily justifies colonizing. We erase those ideas, and or whites being like the natural leaders of society, and non-whites needing to follow. We critique those ideas, and so instead of having that sort of hierarchical view, we started moving towards all groups having an equal value in the world and their experiences being somewhat equal. In other words, we move from ethnocentrism to cultural relativism. So what that creates is a society where there is no overarching value system. And so what matters now is basically how you see yourself or how you see your group, and you create knowledge or you understand the world through your group experiences. And I think that's an accurate interpretation of our world today. And this was before we had the internet explosion in the 90s and early 2000s. So given that, it does stand to reason that how we see the world, or we can do research on how different groups see the world and then make that, so this is the application of critical theory from postmodernism. So now we can theorize, well, okay, this group is in power, this is their particular identity and their particular interests, so they're going to try and impose this particular view of the world on everyone else. So let's critique that, and let's look at this group's idea of the world, and let's see if we can make this group's idea also important. And I see that there's a fundamental truth in that, actually. Some people don't agree with that, actually, and I understand it, but I can see the value in taking that approach for a lot of social issues.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned and come back to the fundamental truth and sort of writing down some things, some jotting notes to think about, threads to pull on. And one of the things about as I understand it, sort of postmodernism and a concern and a critique of it is the ways in which we find sort of that objective and fundamental truth, right? That the idea is that we all have our different ways of knowing, and epistemologically that underpinning becomes so shaky, it feels like, while I guess maybe a better way to think about that, like, how do we balance the recognition and acknowledgement of people's lived experiences and how they view and think about the world with what we think about as being objectively or fundamentally true? Because those two things seem to be, in lots of cases, as we're working through or seeing these conversations and these conflicts and flashpoints, those two things seem to be in conflict. Or does that make sense, or do they feel like they're in conflict in your mind?
Oh yes, they are, most definitely, and I'm not always entirely sure how to reconcile it. I mean, I understand totally that people see the world differently. As a black man, when it comes to race issues, not everything, but when it comes to race issues, my interpretation of events will be colored by my racial background, and I think it's also the case for white folks and Hispanic folks and Asian folks. So, I agree with that, but it's also the case that there are some issues that we need to come to some consensus about what it means. And I don't know. I really don't. I will tell you that I think that when it comes to a lot of critical theorists, it all comes down to power and negotiation. So
right.
it all depends on, can you gain control of how we think about these things? Can you produce a narrative that becomes the dominant narrative? And but yeah, it's pretty tough. I mean, I don't have an answer for that, actually.
Right. Well, you're supposed to have all the answers right now. So that's the trickiness of this, and it feels so often like a moving target, and I appreciate that you say you don't have the answers, and I also don't want to cast you into the role of trying to have the answers, or be the defender of critical theory. That was not my intent. So as we're thinking about how do we think through this, right? So it is, I think, about, best I can tell from what I understand, the narrative and controlling and that power piece. And when we hear those words like dismantle and deconstruct, and we're sort of redefining words. I mean, what it means and how it's defined to be racist has now been redefined, or is redefined in many circles. I think Merriam-Webster is looking at, I don't know if they've come up with a new one, but the addition of power in there, which doesn't. It doesn't make sense to me necessarily. I can see how you could use that word power in that context, but it starts to become, and this gets to some of the left-right political issues that I'm finding. Like, I was talking with my parents, and my mom was telling me, oh, she saw this, and I said, Mom, I don't think what you saw is true. And so the epistemological foundation of what we think is true, and then of course we're using to make decisions, whether it's voting or how we interact with people, or go on. But when that's so shaky, it's terribly insecure and scary, right?
Yeah. Now, I think when it comes to certain issues, though, I think the emphasis should be on changing the narrative so that it leads to equality. So in the case of gender or race or sex issues, which I guess is the main things that critical theorists focus on, but not always.
Not always.
Eventually, I think the emphasis will move to class, but as of now, it's certainly these race, sex, gender things.
Yeah, I think it's we're seeing some of that class stuff surface for sure.
That's good, because we're certainly in an era of rising economic inequality. But back to the race question. So I think what the idea would be that you want to change the narrative towards more equality, and once that happens, then you can move on to something else. So whatever objective reality there is out there, you eventually want to have an agreement from the minority group that they're no longer oppressed. I think if you get to that point, then maybe you would then say, okay, fine, our work here is done. So maybe that's what's happening. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's.
Sorry
Go
for
ahead.
cutting you off. I wanna say something about that race thing because I've been
Yeah.
hearing that some concerns about that, and I would say that you're right. These definitions have been shifting. I can say that in some ways they should shift. If you learn more about something, then you should then modify your understanding. So, I mean, I used to think eggs were bad, and now I think that they're good. So that happens
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of areas, and so it is the case that we see racism, excuse me, as about a power issue. And I think outside of critical theory, when you actually collect evidence, quantitatively or qualitatively, you do see that what matters most is power. So I think that in the 1950s and 60s, we really were concerned about individuals and how they were racist because it was so outright and overt. And moreover, those individuals were in positions of authority where they were passing laws.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we focused a lot on individual level prejudice and discrimination. And so since that time, the world sees racism in that way, right? The individual racist. But we see that racial inequality is not reproduced solely, or even primarily, I would say, through individuals making conscious decisions. And it's really based on whether or not you're a member of a group that as a whole has more decision-making power. And so you as an individual can be racist, but racism occurs when those individuals sort of, it's not a cabal, but just kind of understanding that, okay, there's a racial other out there. And so I may decide to hire this person, or I may vote for this policy, or that's how racism occurs, through one group having power to exercise over another. So I think that is the more accurate way of talking about racism. But I understand people go, well, wait a minute, it used to be about one thing and now it's about the other. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know. It seems like there are examples that I've heard or I've thought about that seem to me to be about racism or some sort of racist thinking that are not necessarily about power. That the relationship doesn't seem to be about power, but I would agree with you that lots of the cases, especially the broader sense of racism that we think about, is often in that hierarchical power piece. What strikes me again about critical theory, or a major concern, and you mentioned this in I think your discussion with was it Lawson, Carol Lawson, is that right?
Audra
Audra,
Lawson.
yeah, I'm sorry. I thought was a fairly fair treatment of critical theory, but the idea that your conclusion is somewhat, or in some cases it seems wholly determined before you start your investigation, that you're asking the question, not is this an example of racism, but where is the racism? And that then seems to be a corruption of the ways in which we actually find truth, because you if you have a hammer, you're always looking for nails, right?
That's right, and that's exactly what happens. They're actively looking for instances of some kind of inequality. Yes, that's true, and they would be totally fine with that. So the way that I was taught, it wasn't until I went into my PhD program that I encounter this way of thinking. But there's a body of scholars who either are ambivalent towards or maybe outright reject this idea that science is something that you ask a question and you don't know the answer, and then you find evidence and then you say yay or nay. They would say, no, well, fine, if that's what you would like to do, go ahead. But I am specifically doing my scholarship to deal with this thing that I think is out there. And the way the social world works is, yes, if you are trying to find sexism somewhere or racism somewhere, you're going to find it. Or what you do, if you don't find it in the area that you're looking at, then you just shift your focus to some other place, and you'll find it. In some ways, that's a sad commentary on academia and social life, because you can find these differences everywhere if you truly look for them.
Right.
But it's also a problem with academia. I'm kind of doing a digression, but I think it's important. So one of the problems I have is not with critical theory per se, but the prominence that it's gaining. So you can be someone who goes and looks at survey data and calculates some disproportionate access for Hispanic kids or Black kids, write it up in a journal, and say, wow, this is a pretty strong evidence here, and it goes nowhere. Or you can maybe not collect that data, just sort of read things and use a kind of deductive reasoning and then add some politics to it and come up with a nice, sexy term. and then the media takes it.
Right.
The anti-critical theorists, they
Right.
talk about it a lot, which also generates buzz, and all of a sudden that becomes the main thing we're talking about, and that's a problem. There needs to be, I don't know how to deal with that, because it's very popular.
Right.
I don't have any numbers, of course, but I get the sense that many graduate students, when they enter into a soc or crim or anthro department, maybe even psych, I don't know, but certainly soc, crim, and anthro, they are going to have to choose someone to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of sticking their thumb to the wind and figuring out how my career is going to go. And you can sit and pour through data analysis, a database, or you can do critical theory. There are other ways. You could also spend, actually, in my opinion, qualitative work is the most time consuming, because you have to spend a lot of time learning about a group and what they think. And that also is something that might not be attractive to graduate students. So you can do critical analysis, which doesn't require that. I'm not saying that it's less important, but I do believe it is less rigorous,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned a couple of things that I think are a good segue. So the sexy terms, or the things that catch attention, and one of those certainly is white fragility, and Robin DiAngelo is having a moment. I did, by the way, appreciate it. I think I put a heart or a like or whatever Twitter allows for, that you had made a comment about, I think it was David French that wrote an article about it that was pretty scathing. He also pointed out, and basically called her a grifter, or labeled her that way, for the amounts of money in which she's making.
Oh yeah,
that's
for
right.
That's right.
Which I do, honestly, I do think is a problem, but that's separate, not to be conflated with her theory and her thinking. Personally, as we talk about professional development with schools, and she works with schools, corporations maybe being a bit different, but the amount of money that she's charging schools, I know the University of Kentucky just down the road here is paid, I think, $12,000 for like a 2-hour keynote. And I think about our professional development services and what we could charge and what we do charge, and we try to keep our fees low, because in my opinion, that if we charge more, then that means there's less money for other important work that I think needs to happen. And so I wonder about her ethics in that, but I do think I appreciated that you pulled that out and said, let's not conflate this with her theory and her thinking. So let's talk about that theory and thinking. And I find that theory and thinking to be sort of very counter to, and you mentioned sort of the focus on the individual. I'm curious how you think about it, because I think you contextualized it a little bit differently than the way that I tend to. She has explicitly said that individualism is not what is bad thinking, and that group identity is sort of the first and foremost priority that we should be thinking about, and whiteness is one of those things, blackness is another, and all those things, right? So that strikes me as being really counter to the sort of thinking and teachings of folks like Martin Luther King Jr., who, the content of the character is really about the individual. Not that dismisses the importance of group identity, because that is important. Obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. would not have said group identity is not important, but is it the first and foremost thing that it brings you value? So I'm curious what you think about, or like how you define that individualism, if it's different.
Well, I think I approached it, at least when I read it in D'Angelo's work, slightly differently. I saw it as, at least what she was saying, and I kind of agree that the ideology that we're all individuals and that's the end of it, prevents an understanding that oftentimes people, white and black, any group, works collectively, or that they come to similar decisions or ideas based upon their group position. So let me kind of flesh that out a bit, because I think ultimately we want to get to the point where we're all seen as individuals. I'm not sure if she's concerned about that, but I think most people would like that, right?
I would agree.
Yeah, but it can also be the case that if we make that, instead of saying that's where we want to be, we imagine that we're that way now solely, then it will prevent a discussion about, well, you as a white person tends to do this. Then the white person will say, what are you talking about? I'm just an individual. Why are you trying to put me in a group? And so that would then prevent a further discussion about collective behavior. So in the context of white fragility, or talking about these discussions of racism, which is the purpose of her book, I can see how individualism can block that. Outside of those conversations, though, I don't know. I think it's better to just try to take. I think everyone would just try to look at a person for who they are as an individual.
Yeah, and it one of the things, again, that strikes me about her work, and has been a pretty major criticism, is that it's sort of unfalsifiable. And I do think it's important to note, especially when critiquing her work, that I do think white fragility is a thing, and there are certain privileges or benefits that I get in this culture, in this society, from being white that I very likely would not have if my skin were darker like yours. And that's a reality that I think is worth questioning and thinking about. It strikes me, or I wonder if it's not the white fragility problem, how much of it might be a first order problem of just being resistant to being sort of challenged on anything. Because I do think if I were sitting in a workshop or something like that with Robin DiAngelo, I would get frustrated and maybe display some of those characteristics and traits that she's mentioning, but not because I'm frustrated that she's saying I have whiteness or that I am racist or any of those pieces, but because it strikes me as a highly liberal way to think about things. So the idea that there is white fragility, I think there's value in that. And so how do we get people, that's what we're doing here, that's what Braver Angels and that work, and how do we get people to have difficult conversations about difficult topics and ask really hard questions and be sort of tolerant to those hard questions, and white fragility would be in that umbrella or under that umbrella, or maybe it's more something that maybe you think that it's something that we need to pull out more and isolate a bit more. Does that make sense?
Well, are you saying that we should focus more on issues of white fragility, or
just the issue, like a focus on the fragility of people in general to have difficult, hard conversations?
I see.
The cancel culture is sort of an example of that.
I see. Yeah. Well, yes. First off, you're right that anyone who is threatened with some kind of social stigma is going to defend themselves. It's I'm sure some psychologists would be able to describe it and give it a name. Because it's obvious. People are going to say, no, I'm not. And, it probably would have been instructive if she would have invested more time in talking about ways of not being fragile, or what does it mean to not be fragile. I mean, there are ways, but it doesn't come out. And you've read the book, which is, a testament to you, but I get the sense that most people react to the reactions of a few people who've written about it. And so I always, I'm always reading about, there's no way to not be fragile, right? And that's a concern that I think she should have addressed in some way. Just off the top of my head, I could imagine, I try to link it to a loved one or friend accusing me of something, and how I would deal with that. I could of course say, what are you talking about? Forget it, and leave the room or something, which I guess would be me being fragile. Or I could, listen and reflect. I could say, oh, I didn't know that you saw it this way, tell me more. I could defend myself, but still acknowledge, like I could say something like, well, that's not exactly how I meant things to go down. I didn't mean for that to happen, but I see how it has affected you. Like there are a lot of ways that I think she should have talked about in that book, or some, a second book. I mean, look, she's already a bestseller, so I'm sure she's probably writing a second one. So she should, in the second one, she should talk about, ways of not being fragile. She should also, she is a critical theorist, also acknowledge that Black people come to the table with a certain perspective. And even though I get why she is focusing on white folks, but it's also the case that I, as a Black person, may come to the table assuming racism, given my experiences, my background, and that's also damaging to the interaction. So it would be instructive for her to do that. Since we're on this, I've seen like that focus on that part of it, whether or not I can defend myself from being racist, speaks to a problem in itself, because the first 4 or 5 chapters or more I found much more interesting. When she talks about this idea of individualism and a focus on objectivity, this idea that white folks have a similar racial environment that's not mine. And I totally got that, this idea that everywhere you go, people look like you. Everyone in authority, or most people in authority, look like you. Like, I didn't experience that at all. And so I found that also to be incredibly interesting. The chapter on anti-Blackness, which empirically we know that the attitudes towards non-white folks can be negative, but they're most negative towards Black people. And so I thought that those chapters were also interesting, but they're never discussed. It's always, how can I not show that I'm racist, which is saying something about the phenomena, actually.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. Well, the fragility piece of whether it's about white fragility or, whatever someone might accuse me of or you of or whoever we're talking about, it strikes me again as I think about teaching and learning and maybe shifting some of this to how we do our teaching and learning and set up our education, but the ways in which we're able to have those conversations. And one of the things that struck me, I don't know if you're familiar with Daryl Davis, the guy that he's the Black guy that takes the KKK robes, and he's been on Joe Rogan's podcast.
That's right.
And, he strikes me, first of all, as he gets my vote for being Captain America if they're going to recast it. But he strikes me as being somebody that's impossible to offend. And not that I think everybody can get to that place, but I think as an ideal, I kind of put myself similar, I describe myself similarly sometimes. It's almost impossible to say something to me that I find offensive. You might say to me, oh, you're being a racist. I don't find that offensive. I don't generally respond, or try not to respond, really sort of with fragility, with like, I feel like I've got to defend myself. I think, how do we get people to say, okay, tell me, why do you think that? Like, let's talk about that. If you think I'm a racist, then what's your evidence? Like, tell me about that. And I find that to be I wonder if how we get more people to approach those disagreements. Like you and Wilfred Riley had some disagreements on that Braver Angels podcast or discussion, and it wasn't an attacking, it wasn't, I can't believe you're saying that about me. And that's really what our social interactions have become so much of now. It's Twitter and social media. It's like owning the libs and all of whatever, version of that. How do we shift? And I think there are some things in our teaching and learning that we can do differently around inquiry processes and inquiry mindset of, I'm curious why you think I'm a racist or, a sexist or, whatever the case may be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving in that direction. There's been a cultural shift that I think is a generational shift. So young people, I would say 35 or younger, they've had the treatment, as it were, if I can speak like as if it's an experiment, they've had the treatment of living in a more multicultural world, living in a networked world, living in a world where hip hop culture and global culture is readily consumed. And so what that means is that when they are approached with this idea that they're thinking racially, that they might be more receptive to it. I think people who are older, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to require a lot of work. Having discussions about white fragility can help, but I think that it's going to be harder for people of my generation and your generation, because we grew up in a world where whiteness was the center, and it was even odd to talk about white people as a race, other than that you check the census box. I mean, that your race mattered. And I see that that's already starting to happen. I mean, you saying that, you have some privilege because of your race is a step forward. And I think over time, it's just a matter of more and more of these discussions being had, and white folks just accepting that, okay, it's not personal. I understand that this is how the world is organized, or at least the United States is organized, and so we have to deal with it. I think the most damaging thing we have going right now is attaching morality to racial behaviors. I don't see it as moral at all. I think it's just human behavior, and maybe the overt acts of racism we would certainly label as immoral. But I think the things that are happening now that reproduce this racial inequality are not immoral at all. And so it's just life. It's just people living.
Do you have an example of that?
Oh, sure. In fact, that's the thing that I'm most interested in exploring when I get the time is these everyday behaviors. So I think in the Braver Angels discussion, I guess it was a discussion. You're right. It wasn't really a debate, was it? It was more of a discussion. I talked about this work done by a Rutgers scholar, Nancy DiTomaso, where she interviewed a random sample of 200 white people and got their job histories, and she found that consistently across the board, they were getting help from other white people to get a job. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, the way she contextualized it is that this is a form of benign discrimination because you're just helping your friends. But because white networks tend to be very homophilous, you go in your iPhone and look at your 10 contacts, how many of them are not white? That's a pretty quick and fast way of a quick and dirty way of seeing how homophilous your networks are. So they're pretty. It's going to be mainly white folks, as with other racial groups. But what that means for reproducing inequality is that in those networks are the job offers, the tips on, in my case, as a professor, getting grants or co-authoring books, all these types of things. It happens in those informal networks. So that's one of the ways that inequality is reproduced. Another way, and this speaks to a kind of, it's anti-Blackness, but I don't think that there's anything to do about it. There was a book by OkCupid, the co-founder of OkCupid, Christian Rudder, and it's called Dataclysm, and he talks about dating patterns of all types. But one of the chapters focuses on racial dating patterns, and he showed how non-black daters consistently voted or rated black potential partners lower, and he had a way of matching them without race first. So I've never used OkCupid, but there's some kind of match rating system that's not racial, and you can see how you fit with someone based upon what you like first without seeing them. But then you also get to rate the person when you see them. And so this speaks to anti-blackness as well. So non-white partners were consistently, potential partners were rated lower than whites. So across the board.
Sort of an in-group bias? Is that?
Well, no, actually, it's, if you're white, Hispanic, or Asian, then you prefer your group and also white people. So there's no fault for being white.
Right.
You actually get a benefit. However, those groups voted down black partners, meaning that they're less likely to want to swipe right.
When you say
I
those
guess.
groups, the white and
That's right, all of them, white, Hispanic, and Asian. Yeah.
Okay.
And black women are voted down more.
Right. Okay.
And I'm sort of garbling all this up, but the general idea is that we have these ideas in society about value that I don't think there's much we can do about it. People should date who they want to date. But what that means is that it reproduces a lot of the segregation and the distance between black and white.
Right.
This happens. I interviewed this tech person, forgot his name, but he's in Silicon Valley, and he found it very difficult to get seed funding. And I think he was at Stanford. He got his bachelor's at Stanford, and he wanted to start a tech company. He's Nigerian. And he said that it was just difficult, and everyone around him was nice, but because a lot of the funders were making these snap judgments about the value of a person's idea based not only on their education, but do they fit the mold of what they expect from a tech person? You know, are you a 20-something Asian or Hispanic, white person, right? And those are stereotypes, but look, it's their money. They should be able to invest it how they want. So these are some of the issues that come up, and I don't think that's racist at all. It's just grounded in human behavior.
Yeah, well, it's sort of as you were talking at the beginning of that piece there, it's not who you know, or it's not what you know, who you know, kind of, and you know, the more, another way of saying that is the good old boys network. And I do think, kind of coming back to the class piece, so that I think that surfaces in class as well, right? So I went to Michigan State University, you're at ODU, Old Dominion, and you know, they're not Harvard and Yale, those kinds of things. So there's, I think, to your point, there's some of that certainly that goes on with racial pieces or racial bias or racial interpretations, but then also that the legacy of knowing the networks of being in the Yale network or the Harvard network that I don't know about you. I mean, I didn't have access to that. Certainly, there's a network with Michigan State, but it's not the same. It's not the name of a Harvard or Yale, and it's certainly not the network of wealth and power that is present with Harvard and Yale. And you know, I'm sure there's other examples as well.
Yeah.
So some of the things that we use here for how we think about teaching and learning and improving schools and that kind of thing are sort of four-pronged. So the purpose of school and education, and what are our systems, practice, and curriculum. And I don't know how much you do work and think about the equity and diversity space and how we might help our schools and our teaching. Certainly in the university, you have experience, but you know, I do have some wonders and concerns. I see tons of educator friends and colleagues and non-friends and non-colleagues really pushing out tons of you know, how to be an anti-racist. Kendi's work is really popular right now. Rob D'Angelo's work, you know, to some extent Ta-Nehisi Coates, but you know, really engaging in that conversation. in ways that I do wonder. I'm pretty sure that most of them, and I don't know that it's a fair expectation to have them all do the scholarly research and really look into critical theory and the ties with critical theory, but I do have some concerns about their lack of understanding of the academic and intellectual underpinnings of those works that they're pushing out as gospel, right? That this is what you should be reading, and these are the things that are sort of a truth. So, are there any particular insights? I'm wondering if you have, or that you have, with regards to how schools and universities might think about doing equity and diversity work more effectively. What are some of the questions that they should really be considering in this pursuit of having, cultural diversity, viewpoint diversity, providing opportunities and removing barriers for those of us who are less fortunate and less privileged, whether that's based on race or class or gender or anything?
I like evidence-based approaches to things. I think that a lot of these ideas, you mentioned Kendi. I haven't read the How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Nor have I.
But I think I get the general idea, right? You have to actively work against norms and policies. You can either be racist or anti-racist, this kind of thing. So I think that those ideas are a fine way to start. This general idea of, okay, let's be anti-racist, and then you try something. But I think ultimately you need to collect evidence to see how this is working. I know at my university we have all kinds of diversity initiatives, and I think that they're well-meaning, but I don't know if we are getting the result we want, or if we know what the result should be. So it's fine to look at the some bivariate table and say, well, okay, we've got 10% of our student body is black now, whereas before it was 7%. So obviously we're doing something right. Well, maybe. I mean, how are those black students? How are they doing educationally? How are they experiencing that? I mean, do you talk to them? Do you find out if they're comfortable, they're happy? I mean, these are things that we don't do. It's more of a surface level type, almost a symbolic thing, right? I always make this joke in my classes when I teach the race class. I'll pull up any university's homepage, and what are you going to see? You're going to see 2 white people, an Asian person, and a black person together, and they're all smiling. And it's very symbolic,
Right.
And I mean, fine.
You can't have all white people, and you can't have all black people, right?
Exactly. You got to put that out there, and that's fine. But yeah, it needs to be evidence based. Really, you need to go back and talk to people, or collect more precise data about those experiences. And I can talk about, so where I am now at Old Dominion University, we have a Center for Cybersecurity Research. We started this like 4 or 5 years ago, and because that's like a hot field, we get a lot of students. And then there's also a cybercrime component, which I'm the coordinator of. Okay, because a lot of the courses that students need to take are computer science or computer networking, and they need to have at least some. What is it? I think calculus or pre-calculus or something. So it's not advanced math, but you can't just get by with algebra. So that meant that we had at the beginning a lot of white males in cybersecurity. And cybercrime is fine; it's criminology, so it doesn't require as much math skills. It's more verbal oriented. So anyway, we had to do something, and I don't think it was a sit down saying that we need to get more students of color and more women in, but I just think it was something that we understood. And so I think the university started giving funding or stipends for women and people of color. And I think in some cases it works, in some cases it doesn't, because you're bringing people in who are going for the stipend and the grant. But they're not necessarily prepared for that. And so 3 or 4 years later, when they should be about to graduate, they're switching their majors. So people need to track that kind of stuff. You can't just go with, anti-racism means that there's equal distributions of everyone. You have to be careful about that.
Right. And I think as a addendum to that, you have to look at the evidence, or it seems to me that you look at the evidence and be willing to recognize that it's not working, or that this is continue to ask those questions, right? Because as you said, it seems to be, at least from some preliminary evidence and research, that lots of these diversity and equity programs and programming is not particularly effective, and perhaps even counterproductive. And if that's the case, then doing it as a symbol and pursuing it and putting it out there on your webpage and making sure that everybody knows that you are pursuing greater equality and diversity, when when actuality perhaps it's hurting things and making it worse, then that's not the outcome we want either.
That's right. And sometimes it requires doing some real serious research. Talk to those students. They might have gotten into a program because it was the cool thing to do, or they got a scholarship for it, and they could be having a terrible time of it. But we don't really talk to those students. So it doesn't always have to be data centered. Like what is their GPA, or what is their time in graduating, and it could also just be their experiences, which are equally important.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm curious about, and how this will happen, or what it'll look like maybe in 5 to 10 years, and I guess a concern, getting back to the critical theory and the postmodernism, is the willingness, or what seems like and feels like, and again, it's really hard to getting to the epistemology, it's hard to know what's true of critical theorists, especially when you look at what's on Twitter and in the mainstream, or in lots of the media, what's being talked about, how much of that movement is just a fairly noisy minority that seems to me to be really resistant to questions and questioning. I would really be surprised if Robin DiAngelo would be open to question. It seems to me that she's not, but maybe I'm wrong, and I honestly hope I'm wrong. I'm rooting for being wrong there, because the sort of metaphorical truths of critical theory, or of that very left-leaning methodology or thinking, postmodernism, I think can have some value, things that you pointed out, just like there's some metaphorical truths of religion that can and have served some value and probably continue to serve some value. So being able to lean into those things and use those in a practical way towards a better future, and if you're talking about the American ideal, achieving that, but will they and can they be corrective if they find that this isn't racism, or if this isn't sexism, or if this isn't a result of power dynamic, or like, for example, the lack of male teachers in the elementary grades, is that because of sexism, or does that have something to do with the way that our system and patriarchy has operated, or is it just a factor that women tend to be more nurturing, and biologically that makes some sense? Can we question that?
It's toxic masculinity. That's what it is.
That's right.
I joke a little bit. So those ideas, you call them metaphorical truths. I think a lot of it is grounded in things that they've done. I think they call it praxis, right? Where you enter into a scene and see if the ideas that you've come up with jibe with the people that you're directing them towards. So, I was just kind of joking about toxic masculinity, but some of these ideas, like the safe spaces thing, it may have been thought up in discussion and thinking and reading with no data analysis, but then eventually the idea is that you take it to the people that need it, and you say, well, okay, here's this idea, let's put it into practice and see what happens. So it's grounded in something. You're right, though, that I get the sense that the traditional way of advancing knowledge of, okay, I have an idea, you have an idea, let's see which one is the best, they're resistant to that.
Yeah. I'd be curious. Any thoughts on the 1619 project, and not necessarily the veracity of it or the accuracy of it, but the use of that as curriculum. I tend to think that it could be very useful as a piece to think about and question. I mean, the questions that are raised in there, and I haven't read it, kind of like Kendi's work. I'm familiar enough with it, I think, to be able to comment on it generally, but not specifically. The narrative that seems to be established in that is pretty counter to lots of the ways in which we've learned, which might be useful to think about and ask questions like how true is this and that kind of thing. But I do wonder, or have some concerns about implementing that in our schools as sort of this is truth, or this is gospel that is to be believed and believed to be true. Any reflections on 1619?
I have not read it either. I've listened to Nicole Hannah-Jones talk about it. Mm-hmm. I like the idea of including, well, it's really more about slavery though, but I like the idea of including people of color into our history more. Mm-hmm. I think, but I don't know the specifics of, the 1619 project to say. Right. I think. So growing up in South Carolina, this was in the 80s, the textbooks were not written for people like me. I don't think this was I guess at the beginning of that whole multiculturalism thing, or maybe it was going on for a while, but the South is a bit slow on the uptake, maybe. But yeah,
South Carolina, in my experience, working with their schools, it is a little bit further behind some places. Yes.
Okay. So. You don't get a sense of, or I didn't get a sense of pride of being a black person. I got a sense of either not being a part of American history or shame. In fact, I remember all I can remember about slavery. This is really weird, and it speaks to who controls the narrative really has a lot of power in society. I can remember more about carpetbaggers and scalawags, which is obviously something that maybe a former Confederate would be concerned about. That was in our textbooks, the carpetbaggers coming from the North.
I remember teaching a lot about that.
So, okay, well, see, there you go. And look, that was a part of history, and it happened, and so I guess it's worthy of discussing. But I don't remember much about slavery. I don't remember us spending a lot of time on it at all. Maybe a paragraph or so. And I mean, people may not want to talk about that kind of stuff, but this push towards including other experiences can matter. It wasn't until I was in college that I started to realize, these current differences between black and white are not because black folk are just doing things incorrectly and white folks are doing things correctly. There's something more going on here. And I didn't necessarily get that growing up. And while I would not have articulated it as inferiority, I think there's some psychological defenses in place that prevent people from thinking of themselves as inferior, I believe. But certainly there was a sense that, man, I'm a part of a group that's not equal to this other group, and it must be something we're doing wrong, And so having these kinds of narratives that explain things, add some more context to these issues can be important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, and I think kind of to the earlier things that we discussed, being able to use those as a sort of text or narrative to add more icing to the cake, or is probably a better metaphor to make, but the you can generate questions and wonder, is this true? But then you've got to make sure, I think, that, and I think you and I agree on this, that it's first of all open to being questioned, and if it's open to being questioned, then it's open to being proven wrong or falsified. Because if it's not falsifiable, it seems to be, at least to me intellectually, that's going to be a problem. Eventually, at some point, it'll collapse on itself.
Yeah, I think I've seen this tweet being retweeted by Hannah Jones, where she says this isn't historical fact or something. This is an interpretation based on slavery, something of that nature.
It was a version of the story or something. I think I've seen the same thing, and I thought that's interesting. And that seemed to be, to me, a shift from what the earlier position to be. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know what the earlier position was, but certainly from me, just being online, I thought it was, a new understanding of American history. So, but it could be that I'm doing the same thing that many people do. They don't actually, go to the source. They get interpretations of the source. So
yeah, and on Twitter especially, that's a great place to get your hot takes.
That's right. I spend far too much time on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm trying to spend less and less time on it. But I'm mindful of time. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I don't know if you have any parting thoughts, but I definitely want to give you an opportunity to share any of those, but then also any links and places where folks might find you and your work and videos in which you have wine and spill wine.
Yeah. I'll be doing some more of those as more issues come up. Yeah, so thanks for allowing me to. I don't really have a plug. Anyone can go to my website, roderickgraham.com, and then that'll take you to the Twitter and the YouTube channel and all that stuff. Since I've gotten tenure last year, I'm really interested in communicating social science ideas and knowledge. It doesn't have to be about critical theory or race. It could be about cybercrime. So. Or even cybersecurity to some extent, or just general ideas about sociology. That's where I see myself going. So if someone is listening to this and they would like me to talk with them or do their podcast or something, please look me up.
Yeah. Well, you've got videos and you've been getting your voice out there. And again, I think I appreciate your humility and grace and humor in some cases. I think we need more of that and less screaming at each other and more discussion and less debates and all of that. Yeah. So, again, I appreciate it.
All right, I appreciate it.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.